Let's do a quick experiment. I recorded the first hour of dialogue scenes and cutscenes from both Wuthering Waves and Genshin Impact. I left both games on autoplay and didn't count overworld dialogue into the time to be completely fair to each one. Every time some new term or name for an item exclusive to the game shows up, I'll add 1 score to the total.
The sustainer of heavenly principles.
That's a statue of the seven. The animal god Mondstadt, the city of freedom. The hilly trails, the dragon, storm terror.
Mondstadt's elemental sphere and ley line.
Temples of the four winds. People call them animalculi.
Electro monument.
Fatui.
Wu'a Harbor or Inazuma City?
Naznaya.
Into that. Mental site to track him down.
Abyss Order. Holy Lyre de Himmel.
V11.
The gorgeous spirits. Jinzhou. Huanglong. The Etheric Sea. Tacit Field.
Resonator 2.
Tacit Mark.
Tacit Discord.
The Sentinel appointment ceremonies.
And speaking over there. Resonance Nexus.
Desert Highland and the Norfolk Barrens. Reverberation or echo databanks in our Pangu terminals.
Instability quake.
Tiankun's Seed of Fate.
Wave-worn phenomena.
Sugar pearls? 12 Shujin's earthly branches. 4 symbols. Mangosteen fruit. New Federation. The Sonorosphere remnant energy. Element. Retroactive rain. The sexagenary cycle. The mountains of spirits. The Threnodian.
I thought of conducting this comparison after seeing a lot of Wuthering Waves fans saying how Genshin had similar storytelling problems in its first region. I want to preface this video by saying that I really don't have a lot of nostalgia for Genshin Impact 1.0. I actually started playing the game when Inazuma launched a year later, and I don't even particularly like the story before Sumeru came out. I'm not here to say that Genshin Impact's first region, or even the first couple, are the pinnacle of writing. In fact, even before working on this video, I'd already expressed to one of my friends that I actually thought much of the early stuff was kind of bland and generic in hindsight. What separates Genshin Impact from Wuthering Waves, and why I think so many people are giving flack to the release of the new game, is that Wuthering Waves does not respect the player's time at all. While you could argue that video games are inherently a waste of time, Wuthering Waves actively discourages players from engaging with the actual game or story through its scenario writing and dialogue. In Genshin Impact or Honkai Star Rail, you get very little preamble before jumping straight into the story. Both games take very little time to get the action going. When they do linger on dialogue scenes, it's usually to address some kind of present issue, rather than expositing about meaningless background details. The commitment to consistently giving players new objectives and story beats to engage with is exactly what gives Hoyoverse's flagship game such a boost in player retention, and ultimately it is the inverse that will kill Wuthering Waves before it even really starts. I use Genshin Impact as the primary example since it's pretty obvious that Wuthering Waves takes plenty of inspiration from the former game through its level design, exploration, and its combat. If Kuro Games want to create their own Genshin Impact, then I think it's pretty fair to use the repetition as a way to scrutinize how much they fail from the get-go with the story. This is also partly because many people argue you can't compare a 4-year-old game to a month-old title. While I don't necessarily agree with that, I at least think there's no way you can't compare both titles in terms of their start and how they were able to keep player retention long-term. I won't be touching too much on combat or exploration, mostly because I have 3 years of experience playing Genshin versus like a week of playing Wuthering Waves. There's no way of really knowing the depth of the mechanics right now. Plus, with games like these, I find it really hard to focus and continue caring about exploring when the story has almost zero upside to it at all. I also won't be touching too much on bugs or glitches unless they actively affected my first time experience, as patches have already rolled out en masse and issues with plot are infinitely harder to iron out. Did switching to English voice acting break my game? There are some bugs that I do mention that have been patched out, but they did actively affect many people's first time experience, so I think it's worth bringing up. The lack of music isn't the best. It doesn't really come off as like creepy, it's more like, man, they really didn't have a soundtrack for this. I was actually perfectly capable of looking past the game's issues with performance when I was enjoying the combat, but I was absolutely tuned out the moment that the story started, basically from the beginning. In Genshin Impact, within the hour of mandatory dialogue, the player learns about the traveler entering the world, sees an action scene between the siblings and a mysterious god, learn about and obtain elemental powers, go to the main city of the region, fight a dragon in the sky, enter 3 dungeons in order to weaken said dragon, learn the backstory of the dragon and the area, try to rob the church, evade the police, meet the local god, and rob the not Russian government that robbed the church. By comparison, in Wuthering Waves, you see a mysterious cutscene of the rover entering the world, learn about some vague guardian that protects the region, find an evil hole, fight the boss, suck the boss, go to the main city of the region, go to see the mayor, learn she's on sabbatical, get a bunch of garbage from the mayor's secretary, get a physical, the physical goes wrong, and then learn about polio for a bit. A lot of this sounds reductive on the surface, but I'm actually being pretty charitable by cutting out so much of the wasted time in Wuthering Waves. The gap between 2 mandatory enemy encounters was over 40 minutes long, with the only gameplay being the walk between NPCs. Yeah, you can explore between these 2 mandatory segments, but that doesn't suddenly make the required amount of dialogue any smaller. Once you're at Jingsho City, you're more or less locked into the story. The game doesn't even incentivize exploration before going to Jingsho, since the ability to pull for characters and solve certain puzzles is locked behind story progression. On my first run, I found a chest which required a levitator tool to unlock, and I had zero clue what the game wanted of me, so I thought I just had no choice but to keep going on the story path. This immediately deflated any sense of searching I had, since I didn't want to be locked out of more chests and guess I just had no choice but to keep trucking along the linear path. Compare this to Genshin Impact, where it barely takes 5 minutes to go from entering Mondstadt to fighting Dvalin in the skies. Along the way, Amber explains Mondstadt's current situations to the player while traversing to the next waypoint, so it barely feels like any time is spent meandering. This is all preceded by multiple enemy encounters to familiarize the player with the controls and elemental systems before letting players run loose into the region's wilderness. The game subtly asks players to engage with exploration through tasks from a blacksmith and a camper outside the city. Both require players to venture off the main story path where they may find collectibles and chests along the way. Each of the necessary story temples are also spread far apart on the map, forcing players to actively travel between each to get used to the mechanics. Stumbling on an elemental pillar you can't trigger could theoretically happen, but you're likely to have already seen an anemo or a pyro pillar, intuitively telling you that you just need a different character to eventually complete said puzzle. This is exactly how you create a great first impression with your game. A player isn't going to give a shit about your story or world building if they just started, and there's zero reason to expect them to want to do anything besides fight stuff and open chests. By familiarizing the player with the region, you give them an inherent connection and sense of attachment to the place they're at. Seeing the landscape and monuments in Mondstadt give both a sense of wonder and curiosity, with enough context through the NPCs and maps to see exactly what they're protecting in the first place. Wuthering Waves attempts this by having players learn the mystery of the 4 items given to them by the magistrate, but where they falter is through giving zero story context or emotion for the player to latch onto. There's zero prior intrigue about the world because you just spent the last 40 minutes going from one differently colored room to another while being talked at. Sure, the trinkets such as the sundial and the leaf do have an effect later in the narrative, but much of their purpose could have just been written around without having what feels like a meaningless scavenger hunt. The sugar pearls and mangosteen have basically zero purpose, since the former is just there for Yang Yang to lore dump about the lament, and the mangosteen literally just gets solved out of nowhere after meeting a random martial artist who we only even talk to so players can build an attachment for her before she inevitably ruins your 50-50. The sundial just points us to the city hall to meet the magistrate, which we already tried to do like 2 hours beforehand, except actually the sundial is secretly telling us to meet the magistrate at some other time period so that she can reveal the evil scheme of the enemy. Along the way, she also just sort of immediately answers a lot of the questions surrounding the rover's backstory. Way to kill the small amount of intrigue around that plot point. The leaf is the only item which has any long-term ramifications, since it leads to a village where we meet the antagonists of this game. But when only one of the 4 items has any functional use to the player, couldn't you just written any other reason to go to the village? Perhaps the players run into the village's remnants while on their way to Jingsho, or something along those lines? Hell, you can honestly consolidate both of Scar's boss fights into one, since there's barely 30 minutes of space between the encounters anyways. It's not as though the conversation with the magistrate gave the feeling of major revelation that the writers likely hoped it would.
Not really. I don't plan to believe in a hero showing up out of nowhere and protecting us.
Okay, but that's literally what fucking happens, so it doesn't matter what you believe. Hell, she literally leaves again after we confront Scar, so you could cut out so much of the intro of the game with zero loss. It all just feels like such busy work, and honestly, even before reaching the Grand Library, I already tuned out of the game because the first 2 hours had just been spent with my brain leaking out of my ears. When the introduction chapter of the game feels like filler, how am I supposed to have any faith in the writing of the rest of your game? Funnily enough, despite how much I was already lamenting the way the story was handled thus far, I powered through the quest that I was given, and like most, felt the story actually picked up during Scar's introduction. Giving an antagonist perspective adds a lot of mystery to the story, and at least gives some reason to why everyone's so nice to the rover all the time. I can't say that I personally buy into the whole black lamb analogy, but at least there's an attempt at something interesting, if a bit cliched. I even like the fact that you can just flat out skip all of his posturing by just telling him to go fuck himself, which is what I ended up doing, purely because I didn't think the game would actually let me do it. It would have been more compelling if we could hear more from him in the initial encounter. Too bad he dips out of the story just as quickly as he shows up. After the Scar encounter and all of these questions begin propping up in players' heads, we are suddenly faced with a level lock on the main story. Now, level locking isn't something new to gacha games. Hell, even Genshin had a level lock very early on, which I had forgot about. But there's an important point to where Wuthering Waves locks you out that makes it feel much worse in my opinion. Just as there's finally a glint of hope about the story getting interesting, the player's forced to level up to level 14, basically putting a cork in any potential drama going on. Okay, so... I have to level up to 14? I'ma be honest, there's no fucking way I want to do that. This is a terrible way to force players to finally explore the world, since it's the first time the average player would realistically want to stick to the main story and figure out what's going on. I was level 8 by the time I had beaten Scar, and I initially just wanted to watch the rest of the main story on YouTube, because I just didn't care enough to level up all the way to 14 for a story I already disliked. It's like the developers decided to slam the brakes the moment that they found any momentum, and it would have been insanely simple to just move the quest log towards the player leaving the city or being separated from Jiangxing, so the overall story would have just flowed better. As mentioned, Genshin Impact does have a quest lock that requires level 10, but the difference is that the Genshin lock kicks in right as the player has finished the first act and conquered all 3 of Dvalin's temples. This gives enough stakes for the player to be invested in the story, but it's not such a major event that you feel the wind is being taken out of you when you see that you have to reach AR 10. The game simultaneously opens a new area of the map, meaning the players will organically feel as though they should head towards the new land for some leveling and exploration, basically killing 2 birds with 1 stone. The second quest lock does happen during a story critical moment, after a cutscene of the Mondstadt cruise plan failing. Diluc asks for some time to get information out of the ones corrupting Dvalin, and there's also an effective twist by having the sibling of the Traveler lead the Abyss, which everyone had previously spoken very ill of, giving a narrative reason to spend time exploring, while providing a hook for players to continue wanting to play the story. The gap between combat and exploration in Wuthering Waves honestly stays pretty consistent throughout the entire first chapter as well, since there's often stretches of over 20 minutes consisting exclusively of dialogue and moving between areas to speak to someone new. When the story finally begins to pick up with a section playing as General Jian and the aforementioned village encounter with Scar, players are made to feel like the flow between dialogue and combat has become a lot more natural. Your reward for getting to level 14 is an act with one of the most annoying dungeons I've ever had to deal with.
This must be one of the missing notes. Now, how do I connect it with the Symphodi? Part of the score holder just lit up. As I expected, a bell just raised out of the water.
Why won't she shut up? Why doesn't anyone in this game fucking shut up ever?
This is the second Sonodisc.
Like, yeah, no shit. Cool. Something like, oh, it's locked. I must.
Locked.
Yep, there it is.
Guess I'll need
I'm gonna
this
lose
the
it.
right way to go.
Okay, cool. Oh, yeah, okay. This game's treating me like an actual 5-year-old. What's the puzzle? I hit that thing 3 times.
I just heard. It must be the Sonodisc.
Just shut up. Just shut up. I'm losing my mind over here, dude. Just shut up. Gotta find the last Sonodisc now. Guarantee it.
Now the water is all gone.
Oh, my bad. I got it wrong.
One last note to go.
There. Never mind. There we go. All right. At this point, I'm like, Kuro Games, just hire me. Apparently, I know exactly the writing process. And the second half of Scar's boss fight. Once you beat Scar, here's another 30 minutes of cutscenes. There's more time spent in cutscenes than there actually is playing the game in this act, and at this point I'm honestly just used to it. That was the whole act? Bro, that was fucking like 80% talking. I did 1 domain and a boss fight, and the domain wasn't even fun, because the fucking MC wouldn't shut the fuck up the entire time. Also, here's another level lock to 21 this time. Once you complete that quest lock, here's another 40 minutes of dialogue scenes and ping-ponging between NPCs before anything real happens. Don't like it? Too bad. Go fuck yourself. Despite the constant criticism people have towards the jargon being thrown out in this game, I actually also have a lot of issues with how little of it's really explained. The game often waits until way later in the story to explain concepts introduced significantly earlier. I think this is where a lot of the disdain for said jargon really comes from, since it's not like other games don't already have really elaborate and wordy stories. Just within the first 10 minutes of the game, players are told about the tacit discords, the etheric sea, sentinels, Juwei, the city of Jingshou, the nation of Huanglong, resonators, the resonance nexus. You get the idea. The writing doesn't even help explain this stuff.
While they share some similarities in appearance, there are also differences.
Yeah, did you also know that people die when they are killed? By the time the player would learn what some of these words mean, they probably already began skipping cutscenes or just logging off altogether. Some of these concepts aren't even that complicated, but the game then has a tendency to over-explain the words while also presenting 5 new words in the process. Shisha has like 3 lines of dialogue explaining the resonant nexus and how it works when the only in-game use is for healing and unlocking the map. This could have just as easily been conveyed by letting us use it ourselves and seeing that. Another example is the lament, which feels like the worst because it causes Yang Yang to to go on an entire diatribe the moment that it's mentioned. They honestly could have cut every mention of the lament before meeting the magistrate, and just had some quick dialogue saying, oh, if the lament happens, we're in for another apocalypse, to set the stage as to why we have to stop it. I feel like after the lament is brought up as the main objective of Scar and his gang, the story actually incorporates it pretty smoothly. Why does every single character have to be an exposition machine for anything new to the player, while also introducing random concepts like the etheric sea or retroact rain, and not actually explaining them until potentially hours later? I see people bring this up like it's for the sake of immersion. These are people who've lived in this world for years, so they'd casually bring it up in conversation, which I don't think personally works when they know we're an amnesiac and already have no idea what's going on. My other beef with this is that ultimately it doesn't matter for the player. Does anyone actually appreciate people bringing up random topics without being able to ask what the hell is actually going on? Or is it just a cope answer to excuse pretty awful verbal diarrhea? It's not as though this can't be done elegantly as well, since Mondstadt actually has a bit of world-building prehistory through a cutscene showcasing Dvalin's history and corruption. This cutscene actually goes to the lengths of showing a sympathetic side of Dvalin, while also implying some of the disasters Mondstadt had went through, all in a stylized stained glass art style. Wuthering Waves emulates this twice in its main story, once with the aforementioned Scar Black Lamb Tale, and another with the narrator explaining a historic battle in Jingshou. As mentioned before, while Scar's story doesn't necessarily affect the overall narrative in the long term, it's still nice to see the game taking on a more stylistic approach with storytelling. In fact, if previous dialogue scenes such as Yang Yang explaining the lament were instead given this art style, I think it would have been a lot more palatable and stuck with the audience a lot better. Where the game once again overplays its hand is with the cutscene of Jue, which should theoretically do the same thing as the Dvalin cutscene. The reason that the Dvalin backstory works well is because we've had conversations setting up how benevolent Dvalin was before the game's time. The cutscene pays this off by actually showing the personality of Dvalin so that we can understand why Venti and the Knights want to save him. He's no longer this giant monster we have to deal with, but someone who is clearly being manipulated for malicious intent. In Wuthering Waves, we get a scene between Jingshou's old general and a bunch of Tacit Discord monsters. Through the failure and disappearance of the old general, both Magistrate Jingshi, I'll go with Jingshi for now. Through the failure and disappearance of the old general, both Magistrate Jingshi and General Jian are chosen by the Sentinel. This cutscene intends to give some context towards the history of warfare that Jingshou had suffered, as well as set up the special nature of Jian and Jingshi due to their acceptance by the local deity. My issue once again rises from the sheer lack of explanation for any of this within context. There's no setup for any of this. The game literally just has Yang Yang yap this story for almost no reason. I learned far more about the old general, Geshu Lin, than I did about either Jian or Jingshi, the two figures that the cutscene was meant for. We don't even actually learn why Jian or Jingshi were chosen by the Sentinel in the first place. The game just lampshades it as, oh, the Sentinel's real mysterious, who knows how it works. It does a pretty good job though, so who cares? There's also a turning point in the narration where the phenomenon known as retroact rain happened. And again, it feels like I should know what that means for it to be really impactful. All the clues I actually get is that all of a sudden the rain go up and everyone go down. The narrator doesn't explain the rain's effect at all, and Yang Yang doesn't personally go back or elucidate any further on this. It isn't until the plot takes a random detour to find a couple of secret agents that we even learn what the retroact rain is. In fact, the entire plot suddenly shifts towards being about the retroact rain, and the start of Act 6 hinges on the story of Jian, Geshu Lin, and the effects the rain had. So my question then becomes, why not save this cutscene for later? By showing Geshu Lin's cutscene when it's barely relevant, any mystery during Jian's segment is just dashed away since the audience already knows what it's about. Imagine if instead, the player gets no context to Jian's story and what the hallucinations mean to him. We would get Jian's resolve in the face of an unknown former general, unsure of what exactly the context is, but able to piece it together through context clues alone. Alongside Jian's story, players slowly learn about how bad the retroact rain was. This can then be capped off by Jian being the one to narrate the story about Geshu Lin and the war, giving the narration more power as we now know the horrors of war which instigated Geshu Lin's failure. Considering the story ends on the extremely rushed note it does, why not have a small moment with Jian in the overworld when he reminisces Geshu Lin's story with us, and contrast it with how we actually managed to save the day? Hell, they could save this for Jian's story quest so that there's a desire for the players to learn more about him and his relationship with Geshu Lin. Nope, too bad we can't have any narrative cohesion. We gotta use our cool cutscenes as the jingling keys for the audience to still give a shit, even if it just makes them more fucking confused. Let's take a quick detour from the story to discuss other aspects of how this game terribly fumbles its presentation. With storytelling, presentation matters arguably as much as what the writer puts on paper. It's important to hook players in not only through the narrative, but through their use of music and convincing acting. No one wants to go pay for a Broadway play if it's performed by 7-year-olds. In the case of Wuthering Waves, the presentation is unfortunately incredibly lacking, with the biggest criticism being the exceptionally questionable voice acting. Before going into this, I want to preface it by saying I don't really blame the voice actors for how the dub turned out. Many of them are just doing the job assigned to them, and they're not the ones who ultimately sign off on what is a serviceable performance. It is Kuro's responsibility to decide when the voice acting is up to snuff, and if they believe it's not acceptable for their game, then that's up to them to iron out before launch. That being said, it's hard not to be extremely distracted by most of the voice acting of the main cast. Much of the line delivery is incredibly flat and stilted, with the only characters that I honestly liked being Encore
Alto sells stuff without a license. He listens in on people for commercial secrets, and he loves pulling pranks on us kids. But he's not a bad guy, really.
and Scar.
Burning desire for battle. But how could I have the heart to decline? As you wish, then.
Every other voice tend to just sound very lifeless and amateur, regardless of how much effort you can clearly tell the actors are trying to put forth. The worst culprits are also the ones we spend the most time with. Yang Yang is incredibly hampered by some of the most boring sounding, monotone delivery, regardless of what scene she's in.
Scar's illusion that should have injured him.
Stay away from her.
Distinct frequencies of tacit discords. I see. I can feel it in the streams. Over there. Follow me.
Shisha generally has more energy to her delivery, but even during lines where she's supposed to sound excited, it still sounds as though she's holding back, and it just made me generally dislike her being around.
What was that last move called? That looked as cool as Fiamma's killer move. Resonance ability quite like this. You got any other tricks up your sleeve? Like eating a whole tacit discord? Grilling echoes alive?
This all falls squarely on Kuro Games' head. Since the UK-based voice acting studio were forced to put on a US-based accent despite none of them being from the States. If they put too much emotion into their lines, their real accent probably would have slipped out, going against the directive given by their employers. Hell, there are some lines in the game where you can clearly hear their accent slipping through, and these aren't even segments where the characters are emoting that strongly.
Resonance Nexus provides coverage for the whole city. Besides, we've got a protective barrier and strong fortifications.
It's a border city and a fortress.
The other component to presentation which I think lacks immensely is the music of the game. I'm not a music expert or anything, but I would argue that oftentimes the OST is the most impactful feature to a good game. Many soundtracks are designed to elicit an emotional response from the player, so a fitting OST can make or break the entire narrative experience. The game starts off pretty strongly with a compelling main menu track, only for it to be the only song I can honestly say I remember. The rest of the game is mired by the most generic sounding ambient pieces and EDM tracks, which only exist to really fill dead air. There's a reason I'm not even using the game's OST for this video. There's barely anything to put in. Trust me, it'd be a lot easier if this game's music was good. I don't like looking this stuff up either. In a funny twist of fate, as I was playing through the final act, I'd actually encountered a bug I was unaware of, which completely muted the music at the game. I'm convinced this is bugged because this is the second boss encounter I've had no music in. But also, like, is it my fault that the game is bugged? Not really. Wait, my music's been bugged the whole time? What? It took me forever to notice because it was already just so unmemorable, but when I did notice, I just ended up using other games' music, which actually made the whole experience feel more exciting. Alright, now we have a real soundtrack. Much like the voice acting, the music feels like it has no weight to it. It's muffled, it's milquetoast, it just exists because it has to. Honestly, for a second, let's just ignore the Genshin comparisons and go through a couple of different game soundtracks just to show how to do overworld ambient themes without putting your player to sleep. The same can be said for battle and stage themes, which is incredibly important for setting the tone for combat. A great battle theme can make players more excited to engage in fights, while a bad one just makes it all feel like busy work. Even the boss themes barely have any weight to them. Scar's a menacing terrorist, yet his track sounds like the start of a beat which just doesn't ever get going. The only theme that really tries is the final boss theme, and even then it's not particularly great. It's just the only one that's trying to innovate with the introduction of the choir and the use of instruments. Some of the most memorable boss themes in gaming tell you a story, or try to make you understand the impact of your enemies and their emotions. It almost feels like Kuro Games had some sort of inside joke by just basing their entire game around music and sound, only to have some of the most forgettable songs within the entire genre. While on the topic of detours, one of my biggest gripes with the game is actually its want to take departure from the main narrative with little benefit to the plot. I mentioned how a lot of earlier action can be cut out for better pacing and cohesion, but that just kind of applies throughout the entire main story as well. Before the village encounter with Scar, the player just randomly meets Yanqing and goes along with a request to find a soldier due to a promise she made. We make it to the military base where Yanqing is sure he'll be, but actually he's at another camp, and also now we have to fix 2 broken beacons. Once we reach the beacons, we have an entire story slice about some poor bandits. This is never followed up on in the main story, by the way. I can't really complain too much though, since the beacon bit is one of the few times in the story that I actually naturally engage with combat and exploration. We then have to help around the new camp, while also not seeing the conversation between Jiangxing and the man that we were helping her to find. Another setup with zero payoff. Instead, we waste time on the soldiers and attempt to world build further, which falls flat after the literal hours of plot dumping before this. Jiangxing barely even shows up later in the story, so it's not like we even needed to be attached to her or anything. The only actually fun bits of the story is getting to play as Jian, which again has almost zero story significance, but is honestly cool enough at this point for me not to care. Unfortunately, one fun combat sequence is not enough to make up for how much wasted time there was on filler content before. Right before Scar and the Magistrate leave the story for good, players are tasked with finding General Jian and an organization called the Black Shores. To speak to the Black Shores, the character needs a specific type of flower, but rather than Jingxi giving us that flower alongside the mission, she gives us a picture of it.
What? You're like the most important person in this fucking city. Did you not just have a flower on you? Who gave you this photo? Where did you get this photo? And like, why don't you just have a flower on you if you have the photo? After showing the picture to our companions, Yang Yang and Qixia recommend taking the picture to Grandma Lin to investigate the flower. But actually, Grandma Lin doesn't know anything about it, so we should take it to Verena. Verena then goes on about flowers for ages before making a replica of the flower, which begs the question of why we even bothered going to her in the first place. We have a quick chat with an actually interesting character who once again dips out for the rest of the story, and then we meet with 2 Black Shore members. But before we can talk to them about anything, we need a few minutes of quirky jokes about him being an illegal businessman.
Business license, please.
Bro, Qixia's literally being a cop right now. That's crazy. Get over it. Are motherfuckers in Jinsho just carrying their business license with them all the time? Cause like, you don't got a business card, you're gonna die.
Either.
Bro, she's actually being a cop. That's crazy. I'm supposed to like this girl?
Also, time to have a few minutes for a chase sequence so the characters can be separated. Disregard the fact that Rover immediately tells his companions about the plan, meaning there was actually zero reason to have a chase scene in the first place. On the surface, none of these extra situations waste too much time, but again, it just feels like the game has an incessant need to keep shoveling new characters into the narrative without any restraint. Verena is literally a standard banner character like Ling Yang. Why not just give her a story quest to cut out some of the needless blow from the narrative? Hell, they already shoved Ling Yang into the final act without needing to do his story quest, so it's not like there isn't a precedent for them just haphazardly slotting characters in with no introduction. The story is only so long because it feels like any time someone at Kuro would write an idea on the whiteboard, they couldn't bear to erase it. I've seen Act 6 brought up a lot as the moment the story gets good, and I think a lot of that stems from the fact that it's the only act where anything actually happens. Act 6 is pretty cliche while maintaining the constant yapping during important and cinematic moments. We talk to the general or the newly introduced border defense director about the status of Jingzhou, but rather than doing anything about it, they just tell us about how bad the retroact rain is, which we can currently see happening. At least we actually got to meet the general, which is more than I could say about Ling Yang or Yuan Wu. Characters I had to look up because I'd never seen them before. Who the fuck are you? Who the fuck is the other guy? There's this whole Avengers Assemble moment at the start of the act, but it honestly feels pretty flat when I've never spoken to a third of these characters, and one is a flower girl I talked to for maybe 5 minutes. The only part of Act 6 I actually enjoyed was Jian's story segment, which lasted all of 5 minutes and again wasn't that impactful because I already had all the backstory on Geshulan from an act before. Meanwhile, the magistrate Jingxi is nowhere to be found, just spouting the same generic encouragement through the radio. At this point, it's not even exaggerating that she could have been written out of the story revolving around the very city she leads. The only reason I was able to power through to the end was because this is the first time that anything interesting actually happened in the story. The story is very safe during Act 6, but it's honestly a step in the right direction for there to be actual stakes. My biggest gripe is the way the story just ends in an extremely low budget slideshow montage. We see small snippets of all the characters from the story, but honestly, for the story to end on the stylistic equivalent of a wet fart just made me more aggravated than anything.
Hello, wait. Are they just gonna slideshow the ending? This looks like shit. And the audio's gone again. God, the audio cutting out on this low budget slideshow ass ending could not be more fitting for this dog shit game. This game has found every way to be absolutely disappointing. To the very end. This, coupled with the introduction of a marketable plushie, left me with maybe the heaviest sour note to finish the current narrative on. Oh my fucking god, it's another Paimon. Unfortunately for Kuro, the end of the story is what players are left to think about, so any favorability I had with Act 6 now has to contend with how abysmally it all wrapped up. It couldn't even be a fucking animated cutscene? It had to be a slideshow? It had to be a fucking slideshow to end it. This game fucking blows. If the upcoming patches address this, then consider this part irrelevant, but that wouldn't really make this ending any more excusable since again, it's about the first impression. Despite my grievances, what Act 6 shows is that you honestly don't need to reinvent the wheel because you absolutely risk alienating the entire audience by trying too much without easing them in. If they had just cut down on the incessant talking and repetitive dialogue, I really would have liked the climax even with the overall disdain towards everything before it. Does Act 6 justify how much of a slog it was to get to this point? Maybe not, but at least shows there's something to latch onto with the game's writing, and I hope that they see their perception of the latter half of the story as something to use as the basis for the rest of it. They can have their complicated, overly verbose story, just like save it for a couple patches from now. It's not even like Genshin is immune to the word vomit criticism here either, but when it's the start of your game, it's easy to see how bad the writing is. I would argue it's even worse in the case of Wuthering Waves because this game has other examples which have already faced heavy scrutiny. One of the most criticized parts of any Hoyoverse game is the Lafu in Honkai Star Rail, where the storytelling takes a hard nosedive to instead spend 30 minutes explaining each concept in the ship through every character possible. Both of these stories are a perfect case study for why the keep it simple, stupid principle could do wonders on poorly written literature. I'd say Wuthering Waves has it worse, since there's no illusion that the game's story's ever been better. If the writing was airtight during the Jingzhou quest, but tapered off in the second or third region, similar to what happened to Honkai Star Rail and Genshin Impact respectively, at least there's a reason to suspect that the story had some peaks to strive for. Instead, the story now needs to pull itself out of the crater it began in. I've seen people excuse it as typical of Chinese fiction writing, but I frankly don't care, since that doesn't suddenly make me appreciate that it's a pretty bad plot.
The reason that Mondstadt works well as an introductory story is not because it's groundbreaking or innovative, but specifically because Hoyoverse kept the story simple and easily digestible to hook players in before eventually introducing the relatively more complex leeway. Wuthering Waves doesn't have that luxury, and a lot of players probably don't care enough to return, even if something truly exceptional is down the pipeline. And I think it's important to also look at how Kuro Games is trying to get out of the hole they've dug through unfortunate incompetence. Before I go too hard on Kuro Games, I think I should make my general stance on bad game launches abundantly clear. Part of why game releases such as these aggravate me to no end is because I don't personally love the idea of companies course correcting themselves instead of simply releasing a polished product from the start. Games such as Cyberpunk or No Man's Sky are now touted as good titles which have been given praise both due to their current states as well as how the developers were able to navigate the abysmal releases. My take with these situations has always been that I don't think this kind of behavior should be rewarded with cheering. Sure, it's objectively good that the games are functional now, but it also just means that companies will use every Fallout 76 as an example for them to just rush out the product. Everyone constantly complains about how gaming as a whole has some of the most dog shit anti-consumer practices, but it's releases like Wuthering Waves succeeding that show other executives in suits that it's fine just to release garbage for the masses if you could turn it into gold later. I think Kuro Games' terrible launch shouldn't be swept under the rug or seen as a net positive due to apologams and free characters. To act as though the company is generous for trying to put a tarp over a carpet fire is kind of being disingenuous. And I think that Kuro Games deserves every bit of scrutiny and criticism they've received. This isn't me putting blame on the developers, since there's a lot of cases such as the recent Bungie firings which show that ground floor teams understand what has to be done. It feels like many higher ups aren't listening to the data and are like, we just need to win our fans back. They still like us. No, they don't. There's already evidence of Kuro Games taking cost-cutting measures at the expense of both the game and their team, with them laying off over 100 employees or new graduates from their company a year ago with no compensation. We were laid off in the same day and asked to resign. I was only given 2 hours and I staggered back to my workstation. While I didn't personally play in the closed beta tests, there are those who mention how many of the bugs and problems with the narrative were highlighted before the game had even come out. The developers are likely just working with the hands dealt to them by the higher ups, being forced to rush out a game they probably knew was half-baked. If anything, this is exactly why I get so heated in these situations. There are clearly exceptionally talented people working at Kuro Games. You can't make a game like this without having a very dedicated team behind it. We know many of the voice casts can put out amazing performances, yet they were being forced to do an accent to appeal to the highest demographic possible, and for what? I look at the announcement about them not requiring a US accent anymore, and it honestly just infuriates me more than anything. Their reasoning reeks of corporate deception, when the likely truth is that they just didn't want to pay the higher price of US-based voice casts. Seeing them scramble to hire writers or voice acting directors on day one would be hilarious if it didn't scream of ineptitude. The amount of work needed to fix the story and shed the terrible taste of the launch at this point is insane, and it sucks to see what should have been healthy competition for Hoyoverse has instead become a laughingstock that will just follow in the path of its other derivative predecessors. None of this is a win, nor is it Kuro Games listening. It's them seeing that the lessons they should have taken from the games they copy were there all along, and they were too arrogant or pressed for time to learn. I don't want Kuro Games or Wuthering Waves to fail. More good games will always be a good thing, and I was very hopeful for this game months before launch. But I also won't delude myself into thinking this is anything but another open beta test. If this game lives on for a year, good. I want this video to be outdated soon. I want to make a video months down the line saying that I'm wrong. But when there's so many good stories that I have yet to experience, why bother with one that's more entertaining when I rip into it? And if there's any other gacha games we're trying, then let me know in the comments. I'm not the hugest fan of mobile games generally, but I'm trying to expand my horizons more and not just automatically write them all off, so... I also have a feeling this video will be kind of divisive, so a like will go a long way towards showing if these types of teardown videos are worth the time it takes to make them. This video generally took longer because of how much I had to think about my true opinions on this game. If you do dislike the video, then it's all good, and I don't really mind hearing dissenting opinions in the comments as long as y'all are chill about it. I also wanted to get some opinions on my intersplicing live reactions to situations with my scripted stuff. I plan to stream a lot of the games I'm going to be talking about, so if it's too intrusive or breaks the flow, then just let me know and I'll keep it mostly to the script and save the live reactions for maybe a highlight reel or something. I want to drop a quick thank you as well for the sudden reception and explosion of the Holocure video. I honestly thought most of my videos would just kind of exist for me and a few folks, kind of like tapering off in the hundreds views at most if I'm lucky, but clearly it went way beyond my expectations and it does kind of help me validate myself on this whole YouTube thing. I do read all the comments even if I don't reply to them, and a lot of the takes I read were very insightful and pretty well written. I don't use the platform too much, but I will always post video releases or announcements on my Twitter, and I do plan on streaming on this channel soon, as I mentioned, so subscribe if you're interested in that. I want to make a more positive video soon, just for my own mental mostly, and because I have like 800 gigs of Lethal Company footage and recordings with the homies that I want to get off my computer. But for now, I appreciate all you watching and hope you all have a good one.